My folks essentially kicked me out and wrote me off their will since I wasn't their biological kid. But getting an inheritance from a faraway relative totally flipped the script. Let's rewind to where it all began. My world turned upside down when I hit 14. Around that time, my mom decided to get cozy again. This time with a guy who had a son from a previous go-round, Jake. He was already 3 years older, making him 17. And let's just say we weren't exactly instant best friends. The ink on their wedding papers was barely dry when things started heating up. At first, it was just the usual small stuff that happens when strangers are suddenly told they're a family and thrown together. Jake would leave his messy plates in the sink, figuring they'd magically wash themselves. Naturally, I was the one catching heat from my mom or my new stepdad about the kitchen chaos. I noticed my shampoo running low way too fast, only to find Jake with perfectly styled hair that looked suspiciously like he'd been using my go-to product. It was weird, but it wasn't just Jake's stunts that got under my skin. My stepdad dealt with stuff in a similar way. I always seemed to be the bad guy whenever something wasn't right. He'd assume I was to blame without a second thought. And then there was my mom. She was so caught up in making this blended family thing work that she was totally oblivious. She'd downplay it, make excuses for Jake, and act like everything was sunshine and rainbows. I could instantly see the difference in how we were treated. Mom and Tom dropped the bomb that they were having a baby about a year into our bumpy living situation. From that moment, everything was different. All of a sudden, it was all about the baby. The house needed a makeover. And guess whose room got picked for the baby's room? You guessed it. I got stuffed into a tiny, suffocating spare room with hardly any space for my stuff. It felt like a slap in the face. A clear message of where I stood in this revamped family setup. A couple of months later, Nathan, my new half-bro, came into the world and instantly became the star of the show. Jake sensed the shift too, and his sense of entitlement went into overdrive. He bailed on college and crashed back home, bringing with him a storm of late-night bashes and shady friends who were in and out at all hours. Tom brushed off my complaints about the racket and the mess, while my mom just looked sad, as if to say, "What can you do?" It was beyond frustrating. I started crashing at friends' houses more. Anywhere I could find some normalcy. School became my refuge. I hung around as late as I could, joining every club and piling on extra classes. It wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was about staying sane. Home turned into a place where I was constantly anxious, bracing for the next blow-up. It was stifling. One night is etched in my memory. I rolled in later than usual, to find the house completely silent. A note stuck to the fridge said they'd headed out for dinner, without me. I hadn't even been asked to this family meal. That note hit me way harder than I thought it would. I felt like a ghost, like I didn't really matter, and it hurt. Not long after I turned 18, things pretty much imploded. I sensed Tom resenting me having any reason to be out of the house, even though I had a part-time gig. He kept saying it would mess with my grades. Then one night, I came home to find my room totally wrecked. Jake threw a rager while my mom and Tom were out, and my room took a beating. A smashed lamp, booze spilled on my school stuff. It was a total invasion of my space. I called them out on it at breakfast the next day. Tom's response was cold and dismissive. "You should have taken better care of your things." My mom just sighed and mumbled something about families sticking together and moving on. I was done with letting things slide. Everything I did in those years felt like it was under a microscope, but not in a caring way. It was more like they were just waiting for me to mess up so they could point fingers. Jake, who had become a pro at lounging around, seemed to get away with everything, even though Nathan, my little half-bro, was still a kid. The amount of babying he got made it clear who the golden child was. I recall one instance when I was tackling a major science project that I was super into. Even trying to work on it at home was a nightmare. I craved quiet, so I carved out a workspace in the living room corner. It felt like trying to assemble something fragile in the middle of a busy intersection. Finally snapped. Jake would blast his tunes. Nathan would be running around screaming. And Tom would gripe about how my project was hogging space or creating a mess. After gathering my stuff, I headed to a friend's place, whose folks let me use their peaceful dining room. For the first time in what seemed like ages, I could actually think straight. That's when it hit me how messed up my home situation had gotten. My friend was like, "You're always welcome here." The offer was simple, but it meant the world. For me, home was just a place I couldn't wait to get away from. Home is supposed to be a safe haven, but every hour away from it let me breathe a little easier. I started clocking in extra hours at my job. Of course, Tom wasn't thrilled. He often brought up my job as a distraction from my studies, but I knew why he really hated it. I wasn't around as much for him to pick on. As I stashed away more cash, the idea of getting my own place started to take shape. But I knew it wouldn't be a walk in the park. My mom and Tom were incapable of handling the truth. The more I mulled it over, the more it seemed like the only way to get my life back on track. I was a bundle of nerves the day I decided to tell them I was moving out. I'd found a no-frills but decent apartment close to campus. From my part-time work, I'd squirreled away enough to cover the first few months' rent. It wasn't much, but it was all mine. The thought of having my own life and space kept me going. One night, after supper, I sat Tom and Mom down at the kitchen table. With my heart pounding, I tried to keep my voice steady. I looked them straight in the eye and said, "I'm getting my own place." The room went dead quiet, and I could feel the tension rising. You could have heard a pin drop. Tom was the first to speak. A smirk, shook his head and said, like I just told him the dumbest thing ever, "You think you're all set to live alone, just 'cause you're legal?" His voice was dripping with disbelief and a hint of sarcasm. First, my mom stayed silent. She just sat there, staring at the table, her face a blank slate. "I am ready," I insisted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The argument kicked off when I mentioned that I needed my own space and had the savings to swing it. Tom went off on a tirade, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and accusing me of dodging my duties at home. "He looks up to you, you know," he added, trying to lay on the guilt about leaving Nathan, as if that was enough to keep me in a toxic situation. Mom's reaction was more subdued, but no less crushing. She didn't argue with him, nor did she try to block me. She just kept whining, saying stuff like, "Families stick together, and you'll be sorry if you go." But I knew better. This wasn't about family, it was about power. I stood my ground not because I simply wanted my own space, but because I absolutely needed it for my mental and emotional health. I felt like a stranger in what was supposed to be my home. I was sick of being held responsible for things I couldn't control, and trying to squeeze into a family that had made it crystal clear I wasn't really one of them. I spent the next few days getting ready. Every item I packed felt like a step toward freedom, even though it wasn't easy. My mom came into my room. On moving day, I braced myself for another fight, but it never came. Instead, she quietly helped me pack. Our chat was surface level. She asked if I needed more boxes or offered to give away old kitchen stuff. We both seemed to be dodging the real issues, making small talk to avoid admitting this was the end of something. Later that day, when I turned the key in my new apartment door, I felt a weird mix of emotions: relief, sadness, excitement, and anxiety. I was totally on my own now. It felt both liberating and terrifying. The first few nights were rough. The place felt overwhelmingly empty and quiet. I even found myself missing the annoying sounds of home, like Jake's blaring music, Nathan's running around, and Tom's constant griping. As days turned into weeks, I started to love the quiet. For the first time in ages, I could actually relax. I didn't have to walk on eggshells, worrying about Tom's temper or whether Jake had thrown another party. I could come and go as I pleased, eat whenever, and sleep without being disturbed. It felt like I was finally figuring out who I was outside of my family's craziness. A different kind of freedom. Life quickly settled into a rhythm. I juggled work, school, and keeping up my little apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. My relationship with my mom and Tom got a bit better after I moved out. I kept my distance but saw them occasionally, which made things less tense. Out of the blue, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was subdued and softer than usual. "Tom's been reviewing his will," she said, almost casually, like she was talking about the weather. "He wants to ensure everything's squared away." I replied cautiously, not sure where this was headed. After a beat, she said, "He's decided to include Jake and Nathan, but not since they're his biological kids. He thinks it makes more sense." There it was. Stung. Even though I hadn't expected much from Tom, hearing it spelled out so bluntly hurt more than I thought it would. It wasn't about the cash. It was about what it represented. The reminder that, after all these years, I still wasn't seen as family. I forced myself to respond calmly. "I get it." Maybe sensing the hurt, quickly tried to soften the blow. "You get it. This is just paperwork stuff. It doesn't change how we feel about you." Okay. Even if I didn't buy it, I let the conversation drift to other things. But the damage was done. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, with that familiar feeling of not fitting in eating at me. Part of me wanted to confront Tom, demand an answer, or just tell him how much it hurt. Another part of me wondered what point was. For years, that family hadn't felt like mine, so why should it matter now? I eventually decided to let it go. I cut back on visits, kept busy with school and work, and spent more time building relationships with people who actually valued me. Friends, teachers, and co-workers who liked me for who I was, not for what I could offer or because we'd once shared a roof. These were the people who truly mattered. The sting from Tom's will and years of feeling like an outsider started to fade. It wasn't an instant transformation, But the bitterness lessened, though it would occasionally bubble up, especially at family gatherings. When I saw Jake and Nathan basking in the spotlight, I started to realize that some things were out of my hands. I began building my own family and sense of belonging. A few months later, Tom bounced back from his health scare, and their lives went back to normal. Then came the real kicker. I got invited to a family dinner to celebrate Tom's recovery. I went out of obligation, not desire. The evening was just as uncomfortable as I'd anticipated. Tom talked about his healing. Everyone fawned over Nathan's latest school achievements, and Jake bragged about a new gig he'd somehow snagged. I sat there mostly quiet, and it was painfully clear I was the odd one out. This time it hurt. I'd come to terms with my place in the family. I was the outsider, but there were people in my life who cared about me for me, not because of family ties or shared genes. I made an excuse about an early morning and left. After dinner, as I drove home, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I'm okay, I told myself. Really okay. I dealt with the emotional fallout, faced the reality of my situation, and come out stronger and more self-assured than ever. For the first time in years I felt peace. But life had another curveball waiting. Just when I thought I'd finally found some calm and stability, everything got turned on its head again. One afternoon, I got a call from a lawyer I'd never met. His tone was polite and professional, but his voice had an almost apologetic quality. Am I speaking with Jessica Evans? He asked. Yes, that's me, I replied, puzzled. I'm calling regarding Margaret Evans, your great-aunt's estate, he explained, his tone slow and deliberate. She recently passed away and named you as the sole beneficiary. For a few moments I was speechless. I barely remembered Aunt Margaret. She was one of those distant relatives you'd hear about but never really got to know. She didn't have any kids, and I vaguely recalled my dad mentioning her once or twice as someone who'd helped raise him. I hadn't seen her in ages, probably since I was a little kid. And now I'm being told she's left everything to me. I'm sorry for your loss, the lawyer said, breaking the silence. She was an extraordinary woman. Still processing his words, I blurted out a thank you. Then, half expecting it to be something modest, maybe an old house or some family keepsakes, he asked, what exactly did she leave? Your great-aunt was quite wealthy, he replied. Over the years, she made some savvy investments. The estate includes several properties, a sizable stock portfolio, and a trust fund worth around $3 million. My heart skipped a beat. I sat there clutching my phone, thinking, why me? We weren't close. When I was little, I visited her a few times, but our connection was never really strong. My brain couldn't quite wrap itself around it. The lawyer then said, she left a letter for you. I'll send it along with the other paperwork. He mentioned that she went into more detail about her reasons. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, trying to piece it all together. Why did Aunt Margaret pick me to inherit everything? I hardly know her. Was this some kind of mix-up? The next few days were a blur of meetings with the lawyer, signing documents, and finding out exactly what I'd inherited. There were houses, stocks, and personal items in addition to the cash. Aunt Margaret's letter, hit me the hardest. In it, she wrote that she'd always admired my spirit and saw in me a reflection of herself at my age. She described me as driven, independent, and capable of forging my own path, qualities she felt she lacked when she was younger. She wanted to give me the chance to use her wealth for something worthwhile. It was overwhelming. Here was this relative I barely knew, who saw something in me that my own family hadn't. She valued and chose me. My first act was to buy a small house. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, and it represented a fresh start. Thinking about long-term financial stability, I also snagged a rental property and invested the rest of the money. I consulted with a financial advisor to make sure I was making smart choices. Felt surreal. In the span of a week, my life had completely transformed. I no longer had to pinch pennies or worry about how I'd make rent. For the first time I felt genuinely secure and free. However, freedom came with a new set of hurdles. At first, I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance, not even my family. Given our rocky history, I knew the news wouldn't go over well. I don't owe them a single thing. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and mine was no exception. It started with a cousin I hadn't seen in forever, who got wind of the inheritance through legal channels. My mother found out before I had a chance to tell her, and the rest of the family quickly followed. The phone calls began almost instantly. First, my mom called, sounding unusually cheerful and curious. She complimented me, then casually mentioned how tough things had been financially for her and Tom. I could see where the conversation was headed, and sure enough, the floodgates opened. Tom called first, then Jake, and then some distant relatives I hadn't heard from in ages. Each hinted in their own way that they needed a slice of my inheritance. Times are tough, they'd say. My mother even commented, "You know how bad Tom's health has been," as if that justified their sudden interest in me. They all seemed to have forgotten about me, except as a potential cash machine. I was bombarded with requests for cash, loans, and gifts. It felt like vultures were circling, waiting for their chance to pounce. I felt overwhelmed. For a moment, I considered giving in, wondering if holding on to the inheritance was selfish. But then I remembered all the years I'd spent feeling like an outsider, being blamed, dismissed, and overlooked. I'd worked my tail off to get where I was before this windfall. I'd put myself through school on my own without their support, and now that I had some stability, they wanted to snatch it away. When I was struggling, none of them offered a helping hand. When my mom finally asked why I hadn't told her about the inheritance sooner, I found the strength to push back against the guilt and manipulation. I gently but firmly explained to her that our distance was both emotional and physical. I had been shut out, ignored, and alienated for years, as if I didn't belong in the family. This inheritance gave me the chance to stand on my own 2 feet, without relying on anyone. It's my life, I assured her, and I need to live it my way. I'm sorry if that upsets you, but right now I have to do what's best for me. The fallout from that conversation was worse than I could have imagined. Mom accused me of being arrogant and thoughtless. Tom chimed in, lecturing me about how families should support each other. Still I stood my ground. Over time, the calls became less frequent, and the demands for money stopped when they realized I wouldn't cave. It was tough but absolutely necessary. I'd learned a harsh truth about family. Sometimes the people you expect the most from are the ones who let you down the most. Knowing I'd protected myself brought me a sense of calm. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to let them control my life. This inheritance was about taking charge of my own destiny and, more importantly, gaining the ability to live life on my own terms. My communication with them became strained, but I'd grown used to it. Their approval was no longer something I needed, and I wasn't obligated to give them anything. I had friends, mentors, and people who genuinely cared about me not because of family ties but because of who I was. The biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. My younger half-brother, Nathan. I unexpectedly received a clumsy, handwritten note from him. "I'm sorry for asking for cash. I miss you," he wrote in his messy scrawl. Though small, this gesture meant a lot. Nathan, barely 14, was reaching out in his own way. After that, we started texting. Small conversations about his school and hobbies, nothing too deep, but it was something. It was the start of a small bridge between us, even though I wasn't holding my breath about reconciling with the rest of the family. I was building a life for myself, free from dependence on anyone else. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. However, the sense of peace was short-lived. Just as I thought things had settled, my mom contacted me again a few weeks after Nathan's note. This time, she wanted to talk things over. I could tell this wasn't going to be a chat about reconnecting or finding common ground, so I agreed to meet her in public, hoping to keep things civil. We met at a local coffee shop, and the vibe was uneasy from the get-go. She barely asked about my life or how I was doing. Instead, she jumped right into how difficult things had been financially since Tom's health scare and how Nathan's private school tuition was piling up. I sat there, listening, feeling like a stranger in her list of woes. It quickly became obvious why she'd asked to meet. She also mentioned they were considering upgrading the house and that she desperately needed a vacation to de-stress. It was clear she wasn't there to mend our relationship. She was there for one reason. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cut through the tension, saying, "Mom, just cut to the chase." She looked me in the eye and said without hesitation, "I expect you to write me a check for $1 million. I almost choked on my coffee. "Excuse me?" I asked, incredulous. She didn't flinch. "It's only fair. Technically, since it came from your father's side, all that money should have been mine." I was floored. Her entitlement and audacity were breathtaking. She sat there, casually demanding $1 million as if it were her right. "I'm not giving you $1 million, I said bluntly, trying to keep my voice even. Her tone shifted from entitled to outright angry, and her expression turned harsh. "You've always been ungrateful for everything we've done for you," she spat. Her words painted me as a villain for not handing over the money she believed she was owed. Without looking back, I paid the bill and walked out of the cafe. It still blows my mind that my own mother tried to guilt me into giving her money she had no claim to. What followed was even worse. A few days later, my mother started spreading rumors. She told anyone who would listen that I'd stolen the inheritance, claiming it was rightfully hers and accusing me of hoarding it out of greed. Suddenly, relatives I hadn't heard from in years started calling, either to support her or to pressure me into sharing the money. The hypocrisy was staggering, especially considering Tom had excluded me from his own will because I wasn't family. Even Tom got involved, sending me a long, guilt-ridden text about how I needed to think of the family and make more inclusive decisions. I responded with a single sentence. "You didn't include me in your will because I'm not family, remember?" That shut him up for a while. But the drama didn't end there. Things escalated when I received an official-looking letter in the mail. To my astonishment, my mother was suing me. Yes, you read that right. She was suing me for a share of the inheritance, claiming that as my father's widow, she was entitled to a significant portion of the money. I was stunned. Was my own mother dragging me to court? I couldn't believe it. At first I was terrified, anticipating a long and expensive legal battle. I called my lawyer, who burst out laughing after reading the letter. "This is a joke," he said, tossing the letter aside. "The will is ironclad." He then looked into the so-called lawyer who'd sent the letter. The phone number was disconnected, and the address on the letterhead was for a run-down building under construction. It became clear that my mother and Tom had hired a shady, most likely fraudulent lawyer in a last-ditch effort to scare me into paying them off. While I was relieved the lawsuit was bogus, I was also deeply disappointed. Their willingness to go to such lengths for my inheritance was shocking. They'd tried guilt-tripping, manipulating, and now they were resorting to outright legal threats. I was done trying to salvage any kind of relationship with them. I realized I needed some space. After the legal jitters subsided, the emotional toll hit me hard. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and the constant drama was impacting my mental health. That's when I knew I needed a break from everything. We decided to take a road trip after chatting with some of our friends. Nothing fancy, just a trip to a couple of spots we'd always wanted to check out but never made the time for. It was exactly what I needed. Time to clear my head, escape the chaos, and most importantly, figure out what I wanted for my future. As we hit the road, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. A year ago, I was barely scraping by in a house that never felt like home. Now I had financial security, my own place, and the freedom to make my own decisions without anyone else's interference. It felt liberating but also bittersweet. Growing up, I'd looked to my mother and stepfather for guidance and support. To me, family meant having someone who would always have your back no matter what. But through it all, I learned a tough lesson. Just because someone is family by blood doesn't mean they're there for you in the ways that truly matter. Throughout the trip, I did a lot of soul-searching and realized I didn't need their money, validation, or acceptance. I had everything I needed, and the relationships I truly valued were the ones I'd built with people who loved me for who I was, not what I could offer them. In small ways, my friends, colleagues, and even Nathan showed more genuine care for me than my mother or Tom ever did. Following the trip, I made up my mind to write letters to each family member who had tried to manipulate me. I did it for myself, not for them. It was my way of getting closure, of saying what I couldn't say in the heat of the moment. In those letters, I spelled out how their actions had hurt me and how, despite my wanting to be a part of the family, I was constantly pushed aside. I wished them well and hoped they'd move on, just as I had. The only response I got was from Nathan. His letter was simple but sincere. "Thanks for sending the letter. Miss you. Let's hang out sometime." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe Nathan and I could one day build something real, free from obligation or manipulation. As for the rest of the family, I'd finally accepted that we were better off at a distance. The inheritance had been a wake-up call, not just a financial blessing but also a revelation about who my real family was. It wasn't the people who raised me. It was the people who supported me when I had nothing to give but myself. Looking back, I don't have any regrets. I stood firm, protected my future, and found peace by letting go of the toxic relationships that had been holding me back. Life has a funny way of teaching us what's truly important, and I'm grateful for that, no matter how harsh the lessons were. Sitting in my own home, surrounded by people who feel more like family than my actual relatives ever did, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.